So project management has been around for a long time. In the last 30 years, it's become much more formalized to the point where there's now formal degrees in project management. They're either related to construction, or they're related on the IT side or in the software development. But project management is now a formalized discipline. There are many organizations that require their project managers to be PMP certified, and that's project manager professional. And the organization that's responsible for the certification is PMI. And so the Project Management Institute, is the organization that is responsible for the standardization of the body of knowledge. So if anybody wants to actually get certified, you're more than welcome. The topics that we cover are 60% in the on the exam. The other 40% are related to very specific things for each of the particular areas, because they certify for construction. On the construction side, they certify IT, they certify for industrial, and there are specific topics that are covered for those particular applications. And so we're covering the project management piece of the equation. So, and so the PMI is the organization that, if you're interested in pursuing more professional development around project management, that is the organization that creates and maintains the standard body of knowledge as it relates to project management. So can anybody give me benefits? What are some of the benefits to an organization of performing project management? Oh, by the way, if I didn't say this earlier, I do expect participation. So if I don't hear participation, I'll start picking on people. And usually I start with the financial people, Susie. Anybody?
Some of the main benefits.
Oh, one at a time, go ahead.
Project gets done on time.
Okay, that's a benefit. The projects get done on time. Okay, yes, that's one.
It also helps people throughout the project process to stay connected, so that everyone's aware of the steps that are being taken, so that nobody is left in the dark and no details are left out of the project.
Okay, that's a benefit to the organization. What's another benefit?
Sorry? That, there's also the benefit of you don't have a bunch of people doing the same work.
Correct. So management of resources, right? That is one of the benefits. What's another benefit?
Cost saving.
How so?
By preventing duplicate work and making sure the projects are completed on time.
Okay.
You productivity up when you're supposed to, and you, like she said, you don't repeat labor, which costs extra money.
So it's managing the resources which affect the cost, right? So managing the resources, managing cost.
Right.
Okay. Well, let's go through some of these.
Jess, is this a time where leadership and the team determine together or communicate what the goals are? I mean, I have my goals and leadership has their goals, and sometimes it's like this.
Right, we're going to get to that. This is more, what is the benefit of doing project management in the organization? But when we get into defining the project, we are definitely going to have those discussions. And so we'll talk about some of the things that could be done. But fundamentally, his understanding is, why does an organization want to do project management? Why do you want to have project managers, right? We have run into organizations that just give those titles out and don't practice project management. So from an organization is, if we step back from a larger organization, is every organization has limited resources, limited dollars, right? So we need someone to manage those. So to manage the competing priorities, here's another thing that happens a lot in organizations. when you have multiple projects going on, whether they're external or internal or external, you have limited resources. And so you need a way to manage and balance those demands on those resources. And it could be people resources, and it could be financial resources. So project management is a way to balance the demand. The other thing is having a project organization helps clarify the goals of projects and the scopes. Because often, you know, not to pick on the senior leadership, having been there myself, it's very easy to say, I want this done, I want this done, and I want this done without fully understanding what the implication and the impact. Part of having project management is to say, well, okay, these are the things we need done. You're asking us to get done, but here are the demands on our resources. We need help and guidance on prioritizing things. Back to your point, Julie, in regards to setting the goals and objectives. We need to understand what the overall demand is on the resources. Whoever said this earlier in regards to improvement, right? With every project that you do, you should be getting better at project management. Every project should be focused on getting better from the last project. And we'll talk a lot about that because there's some industries, and Mike knows this really well, that, and especially in construction, as we have dealt with construction over the years, is that the same issues they had on the last project, they have on this project, which they have on the next project, is also part of project management, is to identify where those opportunities are to get better and then find ways to implement them within whatever new project comes along. So those things are important. So the other thing is providing consistent monitoring and control of the project. Again, without having someone take ownership of the project, if you have 5 individuals in charge of a project or pieces of the project, everyone's going to go in a different direction. We need to monitor and control those projects. So project management, the tools within project management give you the ability to consistently monitor and control your project, as well as expand communication. Whoever said this earlier about the communication part, absolutely. Project management is a way to communicate with the project team, communicate horizontally to peers, and communicate up into management. Also helps refine the resources. And we are going to spend a lot of time talking about resources. Traditionally, when we talk about resources, we put names associated to resources versus identifying what skills are needed to complete the work or to perform the work. Okay. And so it's taking a different view and saying, you know, I want Mike, I want Guy, because, you know, we go out and we go fishing together, we go hunting together, but they may not necessarily have the skills necessary to perform the work. And so project management, the tools within project management is to focus on the skills required to complete and perform the tasks that have to be completed. Measuring project performance. That's the other thing. A lot of times people get into projects and basically there's 2 things they look at: money, cost, the dollar piece, and the time piece. But the problem with looking at those, the only time you measure those, it's after something has happened. It's about identifying key measurements through the project management process to make sure that if you start to deviate, you have controls in place so they can bring you back on track and not after the fact. And so having proper measurements for performance, prioritizing projects and programs. This is probably one of the biggest challenges that organizations have, especially when they're looking at both external and especially internal projects, is being able to prioritize. Again, every organization has limitations. And so their decisions have to be made jointly, not allow the project manager to make all the decisions on their own, but they have to be done jointly with management. Management needs to understand the load on the resources. Project management then has to come up with ways to ensure that once the priority is set, that you're able to achieve those priorities. So again, these are all the benefits of having a project management structure within an organization. Whether you're in a business that is project oriented, like construction is a project oriented because every job that comes in the door is a project, or internal projects that you have a lot of internal projects within your organization, then you need to have a project structure to ensure that we have priorities and that the demand on resources can be managed so you can manage the cost. So can anybody give me a definition of a project? What is the definition of a project?
A change in process or machinery?
Well, no, that's what you're performing, but give me a definition of a project. That's the work, that's the job, that's the project you're performing. But can anybody give me a definition of a project? So when we use the word project, what does that mean?
Usually it's an investment into a company that will either create a return or cause more efficient work.
So that's true. That's true when it's an internal project. Okay. Remember, project management could be for anything. So think of it this way. How many of you have some work to be done around the house? Put up a fence. That's a project, right? And so there may be an ROI involved. There may not be an ROI involved. You want to add a room. You want to paint. Let's keep it even simpler than that. Anytime that you cook a meal, that's a project. So by definition, what is a project?
An endeavor that has a start and end, and you invest time to reach the goal.
Okay, so the key thing you just said is, it's nice of you to look it up, is it has a definite goal, okay? It has a definite goal. It has a primary sponsor or customer. So let's take an internal project. Whoever mentioned if you're installing a new machine on a production line, right? There should be a leadership sponsor to that project, and there is a specific customer, which would be your production or your operations. If you are, let's take Luke, what you guys do, you sell software. So everything you're doing is you're creating software for your external. So any project or any features that you're creating is to serve that external customer, not an internal, it's external. So some of you have both internal and external. And so there has to be someone has to have ownership within the leadership. It's either a sponsor, if it's an internal project, or if you don't have that, you should have a sponsor, internal sponsor, which shouldn't be somebody from leadership. If you have an organization that you have a project that you're selling to a customer, I think, Julie, what you guys do with ETP is you have an external customer. Everything you do is an external customer. So your projects are for that external customer. And by the way, as we discussed yesterday, that may be ETP as well, okay, as a customer. So when you look at the type of projects you do, is you have internal ones, which you should have a sponsor. In other words, when you need clarity or clarification on a project, you should be going to a sponsor. When you need clarity and clarification, or you run into challenges on a project that's related to a customer, you should be going to that customer. So a project, it always has some end user, which is either the sponsor or the customer. It has set activities, right? Set tasks. They are unique. Every project is unique. Now, when we go into organizations that are project-focused organizations, in fact, that's their entire business is projects, bringing in projects, is we tell those clients what you want to do is be able to standardize 60% of those steps, so you're able to repeat 60 to 80%, and the balance can be customized to that unique project. but typically they are unique, they're complex, and they're typically sequential, which is a little different when we talk about, for you, Luke, when we start looking at what your programmers are doing. They may call them projects or they call them sprints. They aren't necessarily sequential. It's based on features that they're trying to develop for their software. But one of the most important characteristics of a project, it has a start and it has a finish date. Okay? If it does not have a finish date, if it's something you end up doing forever, then it is not a project. Okay? So if we look at operations, where's my plant managers? Okay? You have your plant operation. There are things that are happening every day, right? Now, there may be seasonality to what happens throughout the year, different type of activities, but you're repeating those activities on an annual basis based on the seasonality of your business. And so, which is different than a project. A project is going to start, if we're going to talk about the installation of a piece of equipment on a new production line, what we're talking about is it's a one-time deal. So you go in, you remove the old piece of equipment, you put the new piece of equipment, and you're done. And so, which is not the same thing as now, it's not the same thing as you're constantly providing preventive maintenance, for example, right? There are little projects, but preventive maintenance is part of your standard operation. And again, it can be seasonal based on your seasons, business seasons. And every business has a different seasons. But again, very important to understand, a project has to have a start date and a completion date and a finish date. We have walked into organizations that are project-oriented organizations where they've had projects just linger for long periods of time. And then eventually they, quote unquote, become part of normal work. At that point, it's no longer a project. Now, on a financial perspective, what we need to talk about is same thing applies. The reason you have a finish date from a financial perspective, at the end of that finish date, whatever that date may be at the end of work, at the end of construction, at the end of warranty, whatever that is, there is a finish date that you will no longer be spending any more money on that project and you're done. So the key also, to bring it back in simple terms, when you make dinner, you complete dinner once you start eating dinner, right? It's not that you're constantly cooking dinner all night long and the following day, right? That just becomes a normal thing. But when you have a specific dinner that you're preparing, it comes to an end the moment you serve it. And so that's a project. Other characteristics of a project is understand that a project is temporary. There will be a completion date. It's not forever. Now, some projects may be very long. My projects at Siemens averaged 5 to 6 years. They were very long projects because we would do everything from development of whatever new product or systems they needed on the vehicle side as well as the rail side, all the way through the end of warranty period. And in some cases, I had one project that actually I left after before it was completed, is because it had a 10-year duration to run the railroad. This was in Valencia, Venezuela. And basically it was design, build, and operate. And that was going to be a 20-some-odd year project before it completed. And so some of these projects can be very long. Others can be very, very short. The other thing about a project, limited resources. No such thing as infinite resources. You have limitations in dollars and people. You have limitations in uncertainty and risk. And by the way, this is the area that most people forget, is the uncertainty and risk. So in this course, we will be talking about uncertainty and risk at every single step of the planning phase of a project. And then you're going to have to repeat it again when we get to the actual execution of the project. At every step, we have to understand what is the uncertainty and what is the risk, and how are we mitigating that risk. And every single project, I don't think I've ever seen one that does not have conflict. It's pretty standard on every project. There's always going to be some level of conflict. But more importantly is how, as project managers, project coordinators, how we manage and resolve that conflict. That's the key. And we'll talk about some of the tools in the toolbox to help avoid some of those conflicts. And then if they do occur, how to manage those conflicts. And the other thing is there is no such thing as a one-person project. People may think there's a one-person project, but it's always multidiscipline, because it always requires additional resources. Unless people are creating their own materials, you're going to be dealing with getting supplies. So it's going to require having more than one person that's going to do it all. Unless you're at home building your own fence, right, Guy? Then you do it all.
Yeah, from ground up, and do it again, and then learn you should have planned better.
So that's the definition of a project. So when we look at project management, the definition of project management. So the definition of project management is the application of knowledge, skills, tools, techniques to manage project activities, okay, in order to complete the requirements of the project. So as we have this conversation, is the definition of a project is one. And again, the most critical understanding of a definition is there is an end, there's a start date, and there's an end date to a project, and there are limited resources for a project. Project management then becomes having the skills and knowledge and the tools to create the planning and to manage that project to completion. So project management is an art and is a science. I would argue, just by my own experience, and I'm sure anybody's been doing this professionally for his project management, that project management is 80% art and 20% science, tools, and techniques. Okay? We're going to spend some time on we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the art piece, because the tools, the science, that's the easy part, right? Because this part, the set of tools and methods, is what we're going to show you, and how to apply those tools. That's the science behind it. But it is the art, because in most organizations, unless you were in a long-term project like my projects, where at Siemens, our structure, our organization is the project manager was basically the head of his own organization. So when I was a project manager, I had my own engineering function, my own engineering department. I had my own manufacturing department. I had my own purchasing department, right? Because the projects were so long, they were all dedicated to the project. But in most organizations that do projects and they do short-term projects, those projects are what we call a project matrix. In other words, you have a project manager and your resources are assigned to support that project manager to complete that project, but those people, those resources do not belong to the project manager. So this is where the art really comes in, because the project manager is going to have to do a lot of negotiating with the department heads and the supervisors and the managers of those resources to make time available for the project manager to complete his project. And so we are going to focus on that, because I believe most of you in here right now, that's really what the resources that you have. Like I said, there are project-focused dedicated organizations that have entire functions that they basically structure we call them at Siemens business units. They were business units. So either a director of projects or a project manager had their own business unit, and they basically operated as a independent business unit on that individual project and to a completion. But again, like I said, the average was 5 to 5+ years. And so it makes sense for that type of work. But if your projects are short-term, 12 months or less, for the most part, you're going to have shared resources. And so this is where the art becomes very important. Having those interpersonal skills become extremely critical for a project manager. And this is where I'm going to say, not every individual is suited to be a project manager. One of the common mistakes that we've seen organizations do is promote folks or make folks project managers when they don't have the skills, especially the interpersonal skills, to be project managers. And they struggle. And in turn, it costs the organization both time and money. And so when you identify project managers, or when you designate quote unquote project managers, we got to make sure that those are the individuals with the appropriate skills, both the art skills and the science skills to perform that work. Now, it doesn't mean that they won't get the work done. They'll get the work done. But what we often see is they do it themselves versus utilizing the resources that should be at their disposal to complete the work. And so keep that in mind. We're going to talk about that multiple times as we go through this first part.
Hey, Jess, real quick, just for everyone's benefit here, we do a lot of consulting outside of just tutorials here in the classwork that we do. We work at actually on site with a lot of companies for extended periods of time. And I'd say that at a minimum, 50% of the project managers by title that I've worked with have been put in that role and probably should not be in that role, or have been put in the role and haven't been given the proper training to have them be successful in those roles. And it's one of the most misrepresented and loosely defined titles or functions within a business that we see today. And it's very hard to find the right person for that title and that function to perform well.
Yeah, it is a challenge. And again, we'll talk about a little more about it, because understanding what are the proper skills, and when you create a project team, how to balance that project team based on the skills that the project manager has, right? So, and we'll talk about what happens if they don't have the necessary project skills that occur. We'll talk about that here shortly. But it is, I mean, we've been doing this for 13 years in my prior life. When I was a director of projects, I had multiple project managers reporting. And when we go into organizations, let me just give you an example. So we were hired by the city of Roseville to come in because they were doing away with their IT department. And so the CIO, the Chief Information Officer for the city, had decided that he didn't want to let go of any of his IT folks. But what he decided to do was to convert all of them into project managers, and they would be managing the projects and managing the outsource company that was going to be doing IT. Now, they had some folks there, so they hired, so they came to us to train them, wanted us to train them, and I said, look, if that's all you're doing, we'll do the training. But one of the things that we will do is during the training, we'll identify some folks that probably should not be doing any project management. And he totally disagreed, right? And so we started the training. So the first day of training, there were several IT folks that, when you look at the typical programmer, okay, Luke, you understand most of the programmers, they're not very good at interfacing with other people other than interfacing with themselves, right? Or the same type of individuals. So I had 3 of them get up, curse at me, and walk out of the room, right? Because absolutely, they said, we're not going to do this. I don't want to be a project manager. I don't want to deal with people. I just want to do my programming, right? And so, it's again to understand is you don't want to convert those people. If they don't want to do it, and maybe that's not the right person. Also, I can tell you, not to stereotype, but I'm an engineer by education myself. I can tell you most engineers are not very good project managers, okay? I can tell you most accounting people are not very good project managers, right? Because they're focused on the number side of it. Any programmers, IT folks, not very good at being project managers, right? They haven't had to deal with, I mean, the reason they get into those type of disciplines is because we want to, you know, they want to focus on the science, they want to focus on the numbers, they want to focus, so they don't necessarily have the right interpersonal skills to deal with people. And as a project manager in a matrix organization, you're going to spend 60, 80% of your time doing that. And that's why we say to be an effective project manager, you need to have those art skills. Otherwise, you run into a lot of challenges. And what we've seen is a lot of project managers don't have the skill. They end up trying to do everything themselves instead of using the resources that have been designated for them to be used. And that doesn't really help from an organization perspective. The work will get done, but the question becomes at what cost? What cost to the company? What cost to the individual? So again, just understand, without a good project framework, which is an action plan, because all you're doing with a project plan is implementing and getting that completed. But again, it's not one individual that's doing all of that. So some key things when we talk about project management. When we start talking about the project manager or the process of project management, this is part of that interpersonal skills. It's facilitating. It's not dictating, right? It's facilitating the planning, right? It's facilitating the scheduling. It's facilitating the control. Again, when the resources and those functions that are supporting the completion of the project do not report directly to the project manager, really, you can't dictate. The only thing you really can do is to facilitate, which again, facilitation is an interpersonal skill that you need to learn. And so to be successful and to be cost effective and to be effective, you need to understand the facilitating skills that you're going to need, because you facilitate. Now, if you become a good facilitator, you can definitely influence people in the direction you want to go, but it's learning those facilitating skills and those interpersonal skills. One of the most important things as it relates to project management, again, we'll talk about this. There is no project manager that knows everything about every function, about how everyone does their job in an organization. And what that means, in order to create a plan, you need to ensure you have individuals who are directly involved in the work to help you plan. Too often, what we've often seen is when we go into an organization, if it's an internal project, the project's given to, let's say, an engineer, and the engineer goes off and puts a plan together. That's great. Never talks to the people. I'm going to install a new piece of equipment. If it's a process engineer, I'm going to install a piece of equipment. They never talk to the people on the floor, never understand what's going on the floor, and then they create this plan. And then they go to those resources that have been assigned to them and say, here's what I want done. And they look at it, nope, rip it up, and they go off and do something different. We actually see a lot of that in construction too. And so, as Mike would attest to that. And so this is why it's so critical that the first thing you have to do is talk to the people who are doing the work, understand what the impact is of the project to them, or the impact of how the work is performed, and then that needs to be brought back in the development of the plan. All projects, like I said before, have constraints in the form of time, resource availability, which is again time, costs, and scope requirements. And one of the biggest areas that usually cause problems on any project is not having a clear scope of work or a clear statement of work. This is where you really get into trouble, because at that point, if you leave it open, then guess what? You're going to be constantly chasing what the end of the project is going to look like. So again, project scope definition is an absolute must, whether we're talking about a product, a service, a feature for a piece of software, a function, whatever it is, we got to have a good understanding is what is the scope, and more importantly, what is included, and more important, what is not included. And we are going to run through an exercise on your project, whichever project the team decides to pick on or pick to do, is we need to have a good understanding of what is included and what is not included. So when we define the scope, we know what that project is. Now, sometimes the projects, again, I'm going to reflect on the project, my very first project at Siemens. It was to develop, and the key word was develop, technology for a new type of train that was being delivered to Portland. Was my first project, but that entire project, what they were asking for the technology that they were asking for did not exist at the time. So as part of the project, we had to develop the technology. We had to develop a new propulsion system, a new vehicle structure, a new traction system, a new control system. So it didn't exist. It was from ground zero. So sometimes the scope may be a little vague when you start, but you rapidly need to start defining what that looks like. Otherwise, it's never ending. And so again, scope is very important as we go through this. So some of the key tasks that are involved in project management are determining the objectives of the project. Now, if it's an internal project, someone in management can say, you know what, I want to increase our productivity, our production output by 50%. Okay, that's great. That's the objective. That's the overall objective. But then you got to break that objective down. What does that mean? What does that 50% mean? If we're looking at, and I'm going to pick on construction. If we're picking on construction, is we're putting up a 34-story multifamily residential. That's the objective. Get that done. Okay, that's great. But okay, how do we break that down? Right? And so we need to understand and determine what are the project objectives. We may have a goal, and that is the goal. The goal is to increase our output by 50%. That's the goal. But what are the objectives that we have to achieve to get us to that 50%? And so part of project management is to define those. We also have to obtain goals and objective agreements. So Julie, to your point earlier, when we start creating our initial, what we call the project brief, which we'll talk about in a minute, this is where we need to get agreement on what is the goal and what are the key objectives at the early stages. Because if we don't do that at the early stages, we're going to be chasing our tails as we are living through the project. We also, as project management, we have to manage the client and customer interaction, and more importantly, the expectations. Because if we do not do that, we're going to be constantly changing the direction we're going. So that is, again, one of these interpersonal skills. You need to understand how do you manage, especially when you're talking internally and you're trying to manage your upper management's expectations. Again, they may give you a direction and say, we're going to increase output by 50%, but what is that expectation? We got to have a clear understanding. What is that expectation? Because again, 50%, I want a 50% increase. In my mind, I can think of many different types of increases that I want to see, but we need to manage those expectations. That falls on the project manager to do that. We also have to ensure that we have the proper involvement of all stakeholders, okay? That work the resources, the stakeholders that own the resources that are going to be allocated. Again, if we're in an organization where the resources do not report directly to the project manager, then we're going to have to work with their department heads, with their managers, with their supervisors. And so we're going to have to, we have to make sure that they involve. We don't bring them involved in the planning, but as we're developing the planning, we should be checking in with them so they understand what their resources are going to be doing on your project. All of this is to avoid conflict, by the way. Everything we're covering here is to avoid conflict down the road. There's team leadership, okay? Especially as we start talking about what a project manager, they are to lead. Here's the thing that we always run into. A lot of times project managers find themselves not only being the leader, but doing the doer. And the project manager should be leading them. Doesn't mean they don't get involved and don't do work, but they should be leading the effort to get the work, get the plan done, and then to go execute the plan, and to help remove any obstacles from the folks that are doing the work to ensure that the work gets done. Resource and schedule planning. Okay, we're going to talk about the phases, and we're going to actually go through hands-on developing the plan, the work that needs to be done, the resource plan, and then the scheduling plan. Risk management. We have to constantly, at every step of the project, need to understand what risk exists, because we need to develop, and this is an area that what we see, it's very common. No one really does any risk management. Everyone just dives into the project, and when problems arise, well, they arise, then you deal with it. But you should do pre-planning and understand what are the potential risks, and you need to develop, again, we use what's called the 5-3-1 rule. We need to identify the top 5 risks. We need to have an action plan, a risk mitigation plan for the top 3. So when they come up, we know what we're going to do. Now, there's going to be a lot of risk on a project, but we'll walk through the process of identifying the risk and then identifying the top 3 that you're going to create mitigation plans. But you're going to constantly, at every step, watch what that risk plan is to ensure that you have some sort of contingency plans to address them if they arise and when they arise. Change management. This is probably, on any project, this is probably one of the biggest challenges, because change management means managing the change of the scope or the change of the statement of work. And by the way, customers get blamed a lot for the change management, but what we have data that has shown that 60% of it is done by the team itself, not the outsiders, not leadership, not the end customer. A lot of it is done internally. And so putting a structure on how we're going to change our scope of work in place and having a formalized structure, and it could be informal, it doesn't have to be to where you have multiple people reviewing it. You can have 2 or 3 people just review and either agree or disagree that that's a change you're going to go perform. A lot of times projects teams take it upon themselves to start making changes, and then that affects everything downstream. Monitoring the progress of work. Okay, so part of project management is we are going to have multiple milestones, not only multiple milestones, but how do we manage the progress? And we'll talk about the 3 key things once we get into the plan, the 3 key areas that we need to create performance measurement to understand where are we in the progress of the project and whether we're on track or off track. So here are some key success principles. One of the first things, and again, most organizations when we walk in, when we're talking about whether it's internal or even those organizations that are project focused, is having an effective and efficient policies and procedures around project control. If you do not have this, then it becomes a free-for-all for every project manager. And so one of the first things, and it doesn't have to be elaborate. We're not believers in writing books, right? You want to keep it simple, but you got to have some policies around authority, decision-making, reporting, some very basic things that have to be in place in order to create a project management structure. So you have, as an organization, and this is from an organization perspective, is consistency. If you do enough projects, you will find that many of the tasks, especially the planning tasks, should be standardized. Okay? Should be standardized. You can create just a standard, and every project manager is going to use these 5 things as what you're going to plan for. The project may be completely different. The deliverables may be different, but you're still going to do these things. And so part of what you're going to see through this class, or this course, is here are some very standard things that you should do regardless of what the end item. And you're going to see, because everyone in here, every team is going to have a different project, but they're all going to follow the same consistent processes and the same steps. A single point of responsibility and communication as it relates to project owners. Now, when we talk about project owners, we're not talking about the project manager. I mean, eventually they become the project owners, but there should be someone in the organization, typically in leadership, that is the sponsor. So there's somebody in the leadership position that if you're doing an internal project, that's the sponsor. Now, the project manager is going to do all the work. This is the person that if the project manager runs into any issues, this is who they go to for help. Because sometimes you need to take things up in order to get some adjustments made to get some cooperation. Now, if you're a project organization, right, like a construction organization, there's the constant battle between the estimating department, which is equivalent of the sales department, and the project managers, who's responsible for what and for what piece. But again, this is being clear. Where are the handoffs and who do we talk to, right? And again, there has to be some level of ownership. Full commitment. Any project, especially internal projects, must have full commitment and support of senior management. Otherwise, why are you doing it? Risk analysis, and contingency planning. You're going to see this over and over. Here's another interpersonal skill. And that is that every project manager is going to have to sell and resell their project, especially when they don't own the resources. So the resources are shared. You're going to have to constantly go to the manager, constantly go to the supervisor, and sell your project, the importance of your project, and to get the work done in your project. So this is an important, what we're going to cover here is the 3 disciplines. As I mentioned before, too often what we see is, especially for internal projects, is the project manager is appointed and basically is they're left to go figure out the plan and then get the people they need in order to get the project done. The challenge with that is you run into some issues. And so you really need 3 types of disciplines. So in other words, you need to have a team that's made up a minimum of 3 people. So the first, you need someone on that team who has project management knowledge and practices. And again, you don't necessarily need a professional project manager as long as you have somebody who understands project management and they're skilled, they have those skills. Then you need someone on that team who understands what's called general management knowledge and practices. And this is really referring to someone who understands the financial side, the cost side, and also understands the HR side, okay? Especially if you're going to be dealing with people. You've got to have someone who understands the management side, the general management of the organization. Then you need someone who understands the specific application. So if I'm working on replacing a piece of equipment on the floor, I either need operators, or I need the floor foreman or the shift supervisor, whoever it is, who knows the equipment that has to be part of this. Again, the project manager doesn't have to be an expert in the equipment and how it operates. They need to be an expert in how to manage the project so it gets done in a timely fashion and under budget and under cost. I mean, under budget and under time. And so it's important that, again, these may not be full-time. It may be a full-time project manager and these other folks are support, but you got to have all three of these. You cannot expect the project manager to be an expert in all of these areas. Even folks that have been around for a long time, you can't expect them to be experts. Now, it's nice to have the project manager either have more understanding of the general management or more understanding of the application, but you're still going to have all three of these you need to have. Because if you don't, what happens? Human nature is to do what? So if I bring in a person off the floor and make them the project manager and has no project skills, what areas of the project is he going to focus on? He or she? Julie?
Hi, I'm sorry. I think we have somebody stuck in the waiting room.
Oh, we do?
Yeah, I think it's Krista. I think she
Oh,
got kicked.
Krista?
Thank you.
Oh, she called me instead of, okay. All right, so give me a second here. So I'm gonna, give me a second, I have to, there we go. Actually, it's more than, oh, I see Kate's coming back. Thank you, Julie. Back, Krista?
Yep.
Okay. Good. All right, so back to the three disciplines. So my question to you, what would happen if I chose a project manager who really doesn't have a lot of project management skills, but comes from the application side? Let's say he's a machinist or a machine operator or a foreman. Where's the focus of the project going to be at? Any thoughts?
Knowledge and practice.
What's that?
The knowledge and practice.
Right,
That
which is
the
what?
specific area.
Yeah, which is, right, it's going to be related to the machine. So
Yeah.
the heavy focus on the machine, not necessarily on the financial piece and not necessarily, right? Human nature is whatever you feel comfortable with, that's where you're going to be drawn to, and that's going to be the focus of managing your project. And again, this is why it's important. You need all three of these to deliver what we talked about at the beginning, which was to deliver the benefit to the organization of having project management structure. And when you have those projects, you need a balance of all three of these. And again, here's the other thing. I know some organizations that say that I'm going to pick on construction, but it's also true in other organizations. A project manager has to come from the field. He has to be an installer. Well, what we have seen, back to Guy's comment, is 50% of those project managers only want to focus on the field. They don't focus on the big picture. They don't focus on the other general management, the costing, those other pieces, right? Or if I have somebody from general management. So if I put, here's another thing. So let me look at it. Let's look at it this way. If I put Susie as an accounting supervisor, make her the project manager for installing new equipment out on the shop floor, where do you think her focus is going to be? Where do you think your focus is going to be, Susie?
Money, the
Money,
cost.
right? And not necessarily understanding the impact of what equipment gets selected, how it gets installed, and that type of piece. And so again, there has to be a balance of all three of these things when we look at project management, right? When you're performing a project, we've got to have this balance. Again, this isn't about assigning full-time project manager for each one of these categories. Project manager is still the one that is responsible for the project, but they need resources from these other areas, and together they should be developing the plan along with a couple other shareholders to come up with the plan of whatever the project is. So let me ask you, Luke, if we took some of your programmers, made them project managers, what do you think their focus is going to be at?
Just the code.
Just
It's
the
all
code.
about the code.
It's all about the code, right?
Yep.
So it's important to understand for any project that you're doing is you got to have it balanced out. Otherwise, it's going to be heavily focused on whatever that individual that's the project manager, if you're leaving it up to that individual, it's going to be heavily focused on what that individual's experiences and skills are. So also we need to understand that project management is a balancing act. So typically we call this a triad, and the triad is balancing the scope of the project, okay? We need to balance the scope of the project with the cost of the project, with the time, the schedule of the project. And it's a balance of all of these things that defines the quality of the project. So anytime we look at any project, the project manager and the project team, because this is a responsibility of the project team, even if it's only 3 people, it's their responsibility to ensure you're balancing the scope, that you're not deviating too far from the scope, because if you deviate from the scope, start adding things to the scope, which means your cost is going to increase, which in turn, time is probably going to increase. Or you start increasing the time, it's going to affect the cost, which may affect the scope, right? So all of these have to balance out. So it's a project manager and project management and the project team, they have to balance all 3 of these items, not just one. And again, this is why you need the balance of folks from a decision making and from a management of projects that understand all 3. You cannot expect the project manager to be an expert in all 3. They understand the importance of the scope, but they may not understand the application, right? Because that's where the application comes into. Need somebody who understands the cost and the impact to cost. So when we talk about changing the scope, they understand what that costs. And need somebody who understands the impact of time. What is the impact of time on the project? So all 3 of these have to be balanced. It's not an easy thing to do. And sometimes you have to give a little bit on the scope, and sometimes you have to give a little bit on the cost, and sometimes you have to give it on time, but it's about balancing all 3 things in order to deliver the benefits that we talked about at the beginning of the session. Any questions? No questions? Okay, so it's 10:20. We're going to take another little break, and then we're going to push it to the end here. So 10 minutes, everybody back at 10:30, 10:31.